and welcome to another revision video for our A&E blood unit. So this is revision video number 2. If you've already watched revision video number 1, you understand that these are here basically just to help you prepare for your test and for you to listen to me re-explain some of the key concepts that we talked about in class. This is going to go through the later sections where we talked about cells doing replication, or you could call it cell division, in order to heal us when we are damaged. And then the last class we had where we talked about different types of cells and the properties of different types of cells. So again, you can pause the video or rewind things depending on how much you need to. And if you have any questions, please let me know. So if you remember, we were doing a lesson when we were talking about different types of, how cells go through the process of trying to heal us, and we also learned about the parts of a cell. And that class had started off with a person coming in, our Mr. Patel, who had some serious problems with his mouth, and so we took a biopsy. Remember this word here? When we took some tissue away and we're going to test it, so we sent it down to pathology. And where a doctor is going to study it to determine whether or not it is something dangerous about it. And so when we were down at the pathology, they asked if we wanted to look at our own cells and compare them to Mr. Patel's. And so you guys took some tissues and you swabbed, or not tissues, but the Q-tips, and you swabbed the inside of your mouth, and you took some of your skin cell or cheek cells out, and we colored them with a methylene blue dye, which actually makes them kind of purplish in color. And so your cells weren't as magnified as this, but they probably looked relatively normal. These are the normal cheek cells, and we would compare them to Mr. Patel's cells, and we were wondering what is the differences between them and how are they similar and how are they different. So one of the things we noticed that they are normal animal cells. They all have a, we all have a nucleus. So here's a nucleus here, and here's a nucleus here. They all have a cell membrane, so we can draw around our cell membrane. Here's our cell membrane here. And they all have some cytoplasm, which I'll actually do in purple. Here's our cytoplasm, that fluid that's on the inside. Here's some cytoplasm on the inside there. So they have some similarities in their parts, but they are different in their structure because something has happened to Mr. Patel's cells. So we see that Mr. Patel's cells have very, very large nucleus. So his nucleus is here, right, where the normal nucleus is actually quite small. And we also see that there's a lot of them. So we see that there's a whole bunch of them that are grouped together just like this. And so since there's so much more of them and their nucleuses are really, really big and they've been really, really active, we can start to conclude that possibly his cells have been doing a lot more cellular division. So before we start to talk about cellular division, what that means for his health, we're going to have to talk about the different types of, or different parts of a cell. So we have animal cells, and of course we have plant cells, and you need to make sure that you remember all the different parts, what they do, and how there's a difference between an animal cell and a plant cell. So our basic animal cell diagram, so here they're kind of using like a roundish box shape, but a lot of animal cells are lots of different shapes, and most of the time they're kind of boxy, but more maybe as a like an oval type shape, more like something like this. You think more kind of an oval shape, but in general they're kind of a roundish type of shape, and they all have essentially the same 3 parts. They're all going to have a cell membrane, which is that barrier between the inside and the outside of the cell, and it's going to control what goes into the cell, like oxygen and glucose, and it controls what goes out of the cell, like our waste material. In the middle, there should normally be a fairly large, easy to see nucleus, which contains all the DNA and all of the genes that are the instructions for keeping the cell healthy and for how to make a new cell when it does division. Now, most animal cells have a nucleus. There are some animal cells that do not, for example, like your red blood cells. The red blood cells do not have a nucleus because it helps make more space for the hemoglobin, which is what helps carry oxygen in the red blood cells. And then all of that space on the inside of the cell, even though you might not see anything, there is a bunch of stuff that's in there. And then all of the empty space is also filled up with a kind of thick jelly liquid where a bunch of chemical reactions are going to take place that are keeping the cell alive, and that is our cytoplasm. So cell membrane, nucleus, and cytoplasm. So these are very key vocabulary words, and you need to make sure you understand them, you understand what they mean, what their functions are, and you can identify them on a diagram. So, based on the information that we've collected from the normal cells versus Mr. Patel's cells, we can conclude that there's a good chance that he has cancer, and that's why his cells look the way that they do, because they have been doing lots and lots of division by multiplying many times, uncontrolled cellular division. They have created a tumor of cells, and so we believe that his cells have become cancer cells, which is very unfortunate, but because we've caught it early, it will be easy for the doctors to help treat his cancer. Now, it's very important that we spot cancer early and that we get a lot of good information when we're using a microscope. So you guys were using a light microscope, right? And so light microscopes will use light. That's why we call them a light microscope, right? And so you're able to see something like this, where the red blood cells, you could probably zoom in pretty well. They might be red in color or purplish in color, depending on how we color them. Sometimes we can add color to them to make it easier to see. But it's not a lot of detail, and we're not going to necessarily get the best information from just using a light microscope. So if we really want to zoom in and get a really detailed image of our red blood cells, or any cell in general, what we want to use an SEM microscope or an electron scanning electron microscope. Up here, you see this word. So scanning electron microscope will use electrons instead of light. And so electrons are a lot smaller than light, and so they can get a very clear, detailed image of the red blood cells. So here you can see a SEM image of red blood cells on the outside. So when we say scanning, it means it only looks at the outside of the cell, not the inside part. And we get almost a three-dimensional structure, a three-dimensional image of the red blood cells. And you can kind of see that weird donut shape that red blood cells have. So depending on what it is that we want to know about the cells, a light microscope is not going to be powerful enough. We're going to have to use an electron microscope instead, like a scanning electron microscope. All right? So with a scanning electron microscope, we can, keep going on so we get a lot more information. It's just repeating what I just said. So we can also compare cells and get a good idea whether or not we're looking at cancer versus a regular red blood cell. So here, being a regular red blood cell, right? And here being a cancerous cell that is next to the red blood cell. So under a light microscope, we might not be able to tell the difference between these two cells because there might be some differences in size, but we're not really going to get that much detailed information. However, if we use a scanning electron microscope, which is what this image is showing you, we get very detailed information about the shape of the red blood cell versus the shape of the cancer cell, and so it's much easier for us to determine that that we're looking at a cancer cell instead of just a weird looking red blood cell. All right, so we know that he's got cancer. Now, other things that we can gain information about if we're using an electron microscope is that we can use a tunneling electron microscope, or a TEM, and a tunneling electron microscope will look into a cell. So here we're looking at actually looking at a plant cell. You can tell because there's a cell wall here on the outside, right? And so we're looking into the plant cell, so we're going through the plant cell, and we're getting a lot of information. So for example, here is our nucleus. This actually in the middle is called our nucleolus, which is called the small nucleus. It's not very easy to see unless we have a really powerful microscope. And then on the outside, we've zoomed in to a bunch of membranes and things, and here we can see mitochondria all grouped together in part of the cell. And the mitochondria also have these little folds of membrane that are in the inside. And we can see these little folded membrane sections, right? And so the mitochondria are super important because they are the powerhouse of the cell. They are what produce energy for our cells, for all cells, animal cells and plant cells. So we talk about all the cells, they're going to need glucose and they're going to need oxygen, right? And the mitochondria is the reason why they need glucose and oxygen. The mitochondria will take that oxygen and it will take that glucose and it will break it down into small little parts. It will break the glucose apart. And as it breaks the glucose apart, it produces energy. It releases energy from the glucose that can be used by the cell to do various activities. So when we talk about what's keeping you alive, what's using that glucose and oxygen, is actually the mitochondria. And so they're super important, and they're located in both plants and animal cells. Okay? So then we also looked at animal cells, and then we're going to talk about plant cells. Now, plant cells are a little bit different from animal cells. They have a lot of extra special adaptations that help them in order to survive as plants versus animals. One of the things that they have here, let me do it actually in black, we have this really, really dense, thick wall that's on the outside of all plant cells, and this really, really thick, strong wall is called a cell wall, and it's really what supports a plant and a plant cell as it grows. So we have bones which help keep us, stable and stand and support our organs, but plants do not. Plants do not make bones, but they do have a cell wall, and so the cell wall is really, really strong. It does not break down very easily, and since it's so strong, it's actually what becomes wood when the plant dies, or when, for example, if it's a tree, when the tree dies and becomes wood, what's left over is just the cell walls. So in your pencils that you use at school, which are made out of wood, you're just holding a bunch of cell walls, which are, again, very, very strong. Cell walls are so strong that we can build buildings out of them, right? So we have the cell wall, which is helping to support the shape of our cells, right? Then we also have these green discs, so I'll try to highlight. So here's a green disc. Here's another one. Actually, I'm gonna highlight them in blue, even though they are green, because maybe I'll make them stand out a little bit more. No, it doesn't work that well. How about we'll use purple? There we go. So that maybe stand out a little bit. So they're green in color, but I'm going to kind of color them purple to make them stand out more. They are the chloroplasts, and the chloroplasts are where photosynthesis is going to occur. And so you all know that plants need sunlight in order to survive, and so what plants will do is that plants will take that sunlight and they will take carbon dioxide and they will take some water and they will mix them all together inside the chlorophyll, and when they mix them all together and do photosynthesis, they will create glucose, which can later be broken down by the mitochondria to make more energy to keep the cell alive. So when you eat things in order to get glucose, well, plants will produce their own energy using sunlight, and the chloroplasts are the reason why they're able to do it. And then our final structure in here that I want to highlight is this large empty space that we are seeing on the inside of these cells, a relatively large empty space. There's a kind of one over there, one over here. And so that is our large central vacuole, or the plant's large central vacuole. And though it looks like empty space, it's actually full of water. It's actually taking up a lot of the volume of the cell. About 90% of the cell can be this large central vacuole. And it's where most water and nutrients and things are going to be stored for the plant so that the plant can survive. You guys know that if a plant needs more water, it kind of starts to droop off to the side a little bit. That's because the cell walls are so thick and so heavy. So if this vacuole here, the large central vacuole, doesn't have enough water, the plant can kind of start to bend a little bit, and that's when we say that a plant is wilting, or it's starting to kind of droop because it doesn't have enough water. So if you give the plant some more water, the large central vacuoles get bigger, and so they kind of push against the cell wall, and the plant will stand up nice and straight. So here's our large central vacuole. Now vacuoles show up in animal cells as well, but they're normally very, very small, and they don't hang around for very long. Where in the plant cell, the large central vacuoles are very, very large, and they have to be there at all times. They're always there helping to keep the plant cell alive and happy. Okay, so these are these special structures that we find in our plant cells that are not located in our animal cells. So let's review all these on the next slide. So we are told that we can sort through some slides and look at any plant cells that we want. And if we're, again, going to look at these two diagrams, an animal cell versus a plant cell, we should be able to draw simple diagrams and identify the parts of animal cells and plant cells on a simple diagram. So it's starting from the gray circle that's in the center of the animal, or sorry, not the center, but in the plant and animal cell. You should know that that's going to be the nucleus. The red barrier that's around both of them, that's going to be your cell membrane. The kind of brownish little disc dots, those are going to be the mitochondria, right, that are producing energy for the cells. And that's the nucleus, cell membrane, and mitochondria, and of course our cytoplasm, which is the fluid around all the empty space in both the animal and plant cells. Those are the four things that are going to be common between our animal cells and our plant cells. And everything that comes after this, those are just plant cell specific. So we have things like the chloroplasts, which are only found in plant cells, the cell wall, which is only found in a plant cell, and of course the large vacuole, the large central vacuole, is only located in our plant cell. So make sure you remember the difference with all these different structures and what they do, and of course the differences between an animal cell and a plant cell. So here again we went through some practice questions and some revision questions. So you should be able to pause the video and answer all these out loud. You should be able to describe the functions of all these things and just compare the animal and plant cells. And then after you give it a go, you can unpause the video and you can see what I put down and just kind of see how much you remember. So you pause the video, yeah? Okay, so let's go through this. The nucleus, of course, that's the control center, and that's what holds all the DNA and controls the functions of the cell. Cell membrane gives the shape of the cell, and it's the barrier that controls what goes into the cell and out of the cell, so what's inside and what's outside. Cytoplasm is a thick liquid around the cell parts. It's kind of help hold things in place, and it helps, it's where all the chemical reactions are going to occur. Mitochondria is going to do respiration. Remember those 7 characteristics of a living thing, right? So respiration is one of them. So it's going to release energy from glucose and oxygen. Specifically, that energy comes in ATP, which we'll learn about ATP a little bit more later. The chloroplasts will do photosynthesis. That means that they'll make nutrition or make glucose for the plant cells. The large vacuole, or any of the vacuoles in general, they're there for storing water and nutrients, and also for moving things around inside the cell. And the cell wall, which helps protect and support plant cells specifically. So we're talking about similarities between animal cells and plant cells. Remember that. Differences first. Differences between animal cells and plant cells, that there are no chloroplasts in animal cells, but plant cells do have chloroplasts. Sorry, jumping around. Okay, back down here. Similarities between plant cells and animal cells. Cell membrane, nucleus, mitochondria, and cytoplasm are going to be found in both. Back to the differences between animal cells and plant cells. No chloroplasts versus having chloroplasts in plant cells. Animal cells do not have a cell wall, but plant cells do. And animal cells will have very small vacuoles, but the plant cell will have one large central vacuole. And so hopefully all of this makes sense to you, and you did very well. And now we can move on to talk about cellular division. So if you remember our story, after we learned about all the different parts of animal cells and plant cells, we then moved on to learn about cellular division. And here, as a pathologist, he was very concerned about some of the skin cells that Mrs. Patel had lost, and we have to replace them as soon as possible. Remember, skin is very important. It has to protect the inside of your body from the outside world. And he's thinking, well, how can we do that? Well, one of the things we could do is grow a bunch of new skin cells for her, or help protect her skin cells and allow them to grow and heal her over time. And then we also have the idea about getting extra stem cells from a lab, help maybe to grow them. We could get some skin cells from her father, and maybe they can help grow extra skin for her. But there's concerns for him and his health, because being a continuous smoker, he's got these sores underneath his mouth or underneath his tongue, and it's possible that that is that cancer that we were looking at earlier, right? And so that's where his skin cells are growing uncontrolled. So they're doing rapid cellular division, just dividing over and over and over again. So then the pathologist wants to go through the steps of how a new cell is formed. And so we introduce basically the procedure, or the sequence of how a new cell is formed. So we know that all cells contain a set of instructions that are used to make a new cell and keep a cell alive. We call that their DNA, right? So their genes. And so what first we're going to have to do, before we can do anything else, the cell has to make a copy of those instructions. Because if there's going to be 2 cells when this is all done, each cell has to have a copy of those instructions in order to be a functioning, happy cell. So first we make a copy of the DNA. Then we're going to have to start making copies of everything else, all the other organelles that we talked about, because again, they need to function when they are done. And once everything's copied and ready to go, the cells will start to pull apart from each other, start to move in opposite directions. And so they slowly start to begin to split in 2. And so the instructions and all the other things that we copied will move in opposite directions, and the cell will slowly start to split down the middle until they're completely divided. And now we have 2 genetically identical cells, and they are identical to each other. They are like clones or twins of each other. Now, the only thing left is that they are kind of small, and so what they're going to have to do next is they're going to then have to grow back to their normal size, because they literally were a normal cell that cut itself in half. So they're half the size of what they should be, so they're going to have to grow back to the size their normal size. When they're that size again, if they need to, they can divide again. And so 1 cell becomes 2 cells, and 2 cells becomes 4 cells, and 4 cells become 8 cells, and continuing on in that fashion. So we can grow a large amount of cells in a relatively quick amount of time. And that's really important, because one of the reasons why we have to do cell division, or why cell division has to happen so quickly, is because we have to replace damaged cells and grow new ones as they die. So to give you an example about your red blood cells only live for about 120 days, and so you have bone marrow stem cells that are constantly growing new RBCs for you, and it's normally about a rate of about 300,000 a second. So that's a lot of red blood cells being produced every second to help keep you alive. Your skin cells are up to 1,000,000 cells a second, and that's so high because you are constantly losing skin cells on the outside of your skin. So the very outer layers of your skin, the part that you're feeling right now, those are actually already dead cells, okay? They're basically just holding on to each other because of a little friction. And so when you rub your fingers together, some of them are going to fall off. When you sneeze or put a coat on, or any type of movement, really, a few hundred skin cells will start to fall off. Now that isn't that big of a problem because you're making 1,000,000 or so every second in order to replace them. So as you're constantly losing skin from the outside of your body, the inner layers of your skin down closer to your muscles, those are still living cells, and they're making new skin cells to replace the ones that you lose. Now, things like your heart muscle cells or your nerve cells, they might never be replaced. So when your heart muscles get damaged or your brain nerve cells get damaged, that's a serious problem because we cannot get your body to replace them. You cannot do cell division and heal over time. So any damage that you do to your heart or you do to your brain is permanent damage, and we cannot get your body to fix it over time. So we got, again, skin cells multiply very fast, right? And, okay, so then we talked about Mr. Cooper getting a blood transfusion. So we gave Mr. Cooper a blood transfusion, and we're worried about blood transfusions because we need to make sure he's the right blood type and that his blood is clean, or the transfusion blood is clean, because we don't want to give him any bacteria. And so we gave him a transfusion. You remember why, right? Because he had lost a lot of blood, and so he was very weak, because he didn't have enough red blood cells or hematocrits to move the oxygen around his body, so he was getting tired very quickly. If we gave him enough time, his red blood cells would multiply from the bone marrow stem cells in his bones, and he would eventually recover, and actually be fairly quick recovery. But he wants to get back to his life. He doesn't want to spend a couple of days in a bed being super tired all the time. So if we give him a blood transfusion, he'll be back to normal, and he'll be able to walk around and go to work, rather than just stay in bed all day for a couple of days waiting for his red blood cells to be replaced. And here again, it's talking about the idea that there are some cells that lose the ability to make copies of themselves as they develop. For example, the red blood cells. Remember, red blood cells do not do cellular division. They do not divide. Right? When a red blood cell dies, it dies. There's no point where it makes a copy of itself. the only way you get new red blood cells is from the bone marrow stem cells that are inside of your bones. So those cells will produce new red blood cells for you, but red blood cells themselves will not do division. They're very similar to the idea of your heart muscle cells or your brain nerve cells. Once they're developed, they don't do any type of replication. So then we're worried about this lump in Mr. Patel's mouth, about whether or not it could be cancerous or maybe it could be caused by something else. Could it be possible that his cells are dividing too much? So that it might be a tumor that is growing in his mouth, and therefore he's going to have to get some treatment to get that tumor removed. And once again, we have a little bit of a revision for you guys to practice and see how much you have remembered. So you can pause the video, see if you can answer all this out loud, and kind of quiz yourself. And then you can unpause it and see what I've put down. So you practiced, right? You paused it. All right, so then let's go through this. So we think about what do these do in the cell? So you remember that the nucleus, that again controls the cell, it's going to hold all the DNA. Mitochondria does the respiration, which makes the energy for the cell, or the ATP. Chloroplast is where we will do photosynthesis and make the nutrition for plant cells. Cell wall will protect and support plant cells. The cell membrane will give shape to the cell and is the barrier that controls what goes inside and outside of the cell. And the vacuole there is for storing material and moving material inside of the cell. So what is the main source energy storage molecule in animal cells and plant cells? So how is energy mostly stored in animal cells and plant cells? That is our glucose. Glucose is our main source of energy. So when we talk about cellular respiration, we're talking about glucose. In terms of drawing and labeling a plant cell, there's lots of ways you could have done it. Maybe you did it similar to this fashion, the way it was done in the PPT. But as long as you have the right type of shape and you're able to draw and label all of those different parts of the cell, you're doing fine. Okay, and one more time, you can pause and try these practice questions, and then unpause, and I'll go through all of them for you. So you paused it? Good. So we talk about making a table, whenever you have to draw a table, which is something that's going to happen a lot in this class. You make sure it's nice and clear. It's a nice box shape like this one. Try to name 4 differences, so we can think of actually, I'll go 3 differences, sorry. Name 4, so there's no chloroplast versus having chloroplasts, no cell wall versus having a cell wall, and a small vacuole versus a large vacuole. Then we talk about 3 things that all cells are going to have in common. So you have the mitochondria, the cell membrane, and the cytoplasm. Wouldn't necessarily say the nucleus, because remember, not all cells have a nucleus. For example, the red blood cells do not have a nucleus. So nucleus would be something in common between animal cells and plant cells in general, but all cells, the red blood cells, don't have a nucleus. And we asked about what a stem cell is, and we're going to talk a little bit more about stem cells later in this video when we get to different types of cells. But a stem cell basically is a specialized cell that can turn into any other type of cell. And so it can differentiate, or it is unspecialized in the way that it can turn into anything. So it's a cell that can become a heart cell, it's a cell that can become a brain cell, it could become lung tissue, it could become stomach cells, anything in the body, any of the 200 types of cells in the body, a stem cell is able to turn into them under the right conditions. And we think about what are the best types of stem cells we can possibly get. Most of the stem cells that are producing all the different types of tissue are going to come from an embryo, and so we call them embryonic stem cells. Now, we've already talked about stem cells already a couple times up to this point in class, because we talked about the ones that are producing the red blood cells. They also produce white blood cells as well. So where do we get our blood cells from? You get them from the bone marrow stem cells. So remember, try to remember that as well. And then the last part is listing the order or the process for how new cells are formed. So we have to go through the process of making a copy of the DNA. We have to make a copy of all of the other cell parts that we need. Then we need to have everything move in opposite directions, so we start to split the cell. Then the cell will split into 2 daughter cells, or the 2 individual cells afterwards are called daughter cells. And each of them is going to get a copy of the DNA. And then the last step will be that the cells grow to a normal size. Whew, okay, that was a long first part, right? So now we only have one more part to get through. This is the damage class. If you remember, we are making different types of cells. We're making little models. So I'm just going to review the different types of cells and, of course, the practice questions that went with that area. If you want to take a little break, go ahead, take a break, and you can come back to this video to do some more revision. But I'm going to move on. So if you remember during this class, you selected a random cell to make a model of and to explain properties about it. And so you had to basically explain the different types of cells and how their functions have to do with their structures, or what they do has to do with how they look and how they're shaped. Okay? So now we're going to go through all those different types of cells that we talked about in class. So you have this paper, and you should have filled out this paper during class, or maybe you might have missed something. Or maybe you want to quiz yourself right now. You can go through this slide and try to see, can you say everything or fill out all of these boxes about every one of these types of cells and see how well you know them. All right? So you can pause it and give that a shot. All right? So you've unpaused it, you're ready to go forward. So let's go through these, and we'll go through it by column. So first we'll talk about each one of the cells based on the columns. So first we're talking about where in the body would we expect them to be. So where in the body are they? So our heart muscle cells, obviously heart muscle, it's pretty easy. Our melanocytes are our skin cells, so we'll see them in the layers of skin. The red blood cells obviously show up in the blood. Ciliated cells would be located in the windpipe and also the lungs. The white blood cells are also in the blood, but they're also in the body as well. They're in the blood, but also other parts of the body located around the tissue. The nerve cells are going to be located in the brain and in the body and the spinal cord. Fat cells will be located around all of our organs in order to protect them and keep them warm. And of course, our bone cells are going to be located in the bones in the centers of our body. So that's pretty simple, right? So now let's look at the job. So what do they do? So our heart muscle cells obviously are there to keep the heart pumping. The melanocyte cells are there to help form the skin layer that protects the body. Red blood cells, as you know, are there to carry oxygen around the body. And the ciliated cells are there to clean the lungs. White blood cells are there to help kill bacteria, whether in the blood or other parts of the body. And the nerve cells are there to move information and help control the body. Fat cells are just there to store energy, and your bone cells are there basically to support the body by forming bones. So that is how all the specific jobs these types of cells are going to do. All right, so then let's talk about some of their special features. Some of these cells have very special features. Some of them have only really one special feature. First off, the heart's muscle cells, they are branched, they have lots of nuclei, and they're all really, really strong because the heart never stops pumping, right? They also have lots of mitochondria. The melanocytes, they're going to be really tough, elastic cells, and they're actually pretty flat and stretchy. Red blood cells, as you know, are round, they don't have a nucleus, and they also have lots and lots of hemoglobin, which is what carries oxygen around the body. Ciliated cells have lots and lots of cilia, that's why we call them ciliated cells. White blood cells have really large nucleus. They're pretty flexible membranes so that they can wrap themselves around bacteria and just kind of eat the bacteria that's in your body. Nerve cells are very long and thin so that they can move information over really far distances very quickly. Your fat cells are relatively large and round, and they've got very few mitochondria because we don't want to use the energy in the fat cells. We want to store the energy that's in our fat cells. And then our bone cells are very tough and hard because they're going to be forming our tough but flexible bones. All right, so then that is all of their special features. And the last part is to think about what can go wrong if they aren't working properly. So if the heart muscle cells are not working properly, the heart stops pumping, or what we call a heart attack. If you didn't have good melanocytes, your skin would be relatively weak, and then it would start to rub off, and you wouldn't have a good protective layer. If your red blood cells were not working properly, you wouldn't be able to move oxygen around the body to all the other cells. If the ciliated cells weren't working properly, the lungs would get infected a lot. Your lungs would be full of dirt and bacteria. Your white blood cells, if they weren't working, then the body would be infected, right? Because they're there to help clean bacteria out of your blood and your body. If your nerve cells didn't work properly, you would have very hard time or possibly would not be able to control the movements of your body. The fat cells, obviously you wouldn't be able to store energy very easily, so there wouldn't be very much energy for other cells. And then with your bone cells, your bones would be very, very weak, and then you wouldn't really be able to support the other tissues in your body. Okay, so hopefully everything on this slide here, everything we just talked about, makes sense to you, because you have to understand these different types of cells. You need to talk about what they do, identify them if you saw a picture of them, or something like that. So make sure you've studied this one really well. So as Dr. Wong is telling you, there are over 200 different types of cells. There's actually about 220 types of cells in your body. And they might all have a nucleus. Remember, red blood cells don't, but most of them have a nucleus, cytoplasm, a membrane, and of course mitochondria. And then they're all designed to do very specific jobs, depending on their size and their shape, and then how they function. So for example, your nerve cell here is very long and thin, so they can travel and send information over really far distances. Your lung cells are very, very thin walls. All right, they're not very thick, they're very thin, so that it's easy for oxygen to move into your blood when you breathe in. Inside of your gut, the cells there have these special little extensions, these little fingers that are sticking out that helps increase the surface area and make it easier for them to grab nutrients like glucose as it moves through your intestines. Your muscle cells have lots and lots of mitochondria because you have to keep supplying them with energy. And of course, your fat cells don't have very few mitochondria because they don't really need mitochondria to burn energy because they're just there for storing energy, not for using it. Your red blood cells, we've already talked a lot about these. They're round, they don't have a nucleus so that they can carry more oxygen, and they're very, very tiny, so it's easy for them to get to all of the spaces inside of the body and deliver oxygen. So all of your cells are basically going to have the same DNA and have the same genes inside of their nucleus. In your red blood cell, in your brain cell, your heart cell, your stomach cell, your liver cell, all of those cells have the exact same DNA. However, they're all using different parts of the DNA. So you can think of the DNA as like a giant textbook, right? And so each of your cells are focusing on maybe a different chapter of that textbook. The nerve cells are using the nerve cell section of the textbook, and the red blood cells are using the red blood cell section of the textbook. And so even though they all have a copy of the same book, they're all focusing on different parts, and that's why they end up being specialized, and that's the key word from this lesson. So specialized means that they're only focusing on one specific aspect of the DNA. So if they're red blood cells that have been specialized to be red blood cells, heart cells have been specialized to be heart cells. Okay? So that is it for this, and now we're just going to do a couple of revision questions. Okay, so for this first revision page, we've got different types of cells. We've got vocabulary words for the names of those types of cells, and then we have properties of them, and then what would happen if they weren't working very well. So what you want to do is you can pause the video and match out these things and see how well you do. Actually, I'll show you the first one, and then you can pause the video and do the other ones. So number 1 here, all right, I'll do it in yellow. So that's obviously not an animal cell because you can see its thick cell wall, and so it's not an animal cell, it's actually a leaf cell. So we go down to C. And what is the leaf cell's function, or what are its properties? And so it contains chloroplast so that it can do photosynthesis. So we connect that down to J. Okay. And then we say, if it wasn't functioning very well, what would that do? What would be the effect? And here we go up to N. It would be that the plant would not be able to survive very well, would it? Because it would not be able to make nutrients. Okay, so something along those lines, you want to try to connect each of these levels to the first starting cell. So you can pause the video and give it a shot. All right, you pause it? All right, so then let's go through each one of these. Next, this one, I know this one, being 2 and 3 actually might be quite difficult, and 5 as well, but actually 2 is going to be the skin cells, so that goes down to D. And so the skin cells, basically there is to flat cells that can multiply quickly and replace themselves as they wear out, because remember the skin cells start to fall off. We make about 1 million of them every second, right? And then what would happen if we didn't have them? Well, we would dry out really quickly, wouldn't we? Right? And we wouldn't be able to protect ourselves from microscopic organisms because we wouldn't be protected. So that goes all the way down here to O. Okay, next we have number 3, and these are actually going to be our muscle cells, so that connects down to E. And our muscle cells, these are designed so that they can shorten or contract in order to make themselves shorter so that they can move parts of our body and pull on our bones. And if they were not working very well, that means we wouldn't be able to keep ourselves upright, or we wouldn't be able to move without them if they were not functioning well. So then it goes up to K. Next here, we've got this one. And this obviously, I think, was easy for you guys. This is your nerve cell, which goes up here to A, right? And from there, whatever its special features, and that it's there to network with other cells so that we can think. And then, of course, if we didn't have this, then we would not be able to make decisions or really remember things or control our bodies because we would not have the nerve cells to build our nervous system. And then finally, our last one here, we have, here is our stem cell, and that will go up here to B here, and then they are spherical cells that can be specialized and divide into any type of cell when they do division, and if we didn't have them, we would not be able to replace specific cells like our blood cells when we are doing when they die and need replaced. Okay, so this is just a little practice of identifying and talking about each of the different types of cells, and hopefully you did pretty well. Okay, so once again, here's an opportunity to go through these practice questions, see if you can answer them on your own before I tell you what the answers are. So you again pause the video and see how that goes. So you paused it? Alright, so let's go through this. So, remember we talked about the fact that all the cells in the body have the exact same DNA, or the exact same chromosomes, which are large condensed forms of DNA. So then how do we get specialized cells if they all have the same DNA? Well, remember that idea I talked about it being like a textbook, and the specialized cells are focusing on a single textbook. Well, that's because if we're to talk about it in real biology, the genes, or the sections of DNA, different genes are being used while others are turned off. So some genes are being ignored while other genes are being used, and that's combination of genes is how we get a specialized cell. So again, it's that idea of being a textbook. Some genes you could think of them as chapters in the book. So the chapters that we're reading are the chapters that are being used. Those are the genes that are being used to create that special cell. All the chapters that are not being used, those are the genes that are turned off and that are being ignored. So by using some genes and ignoring other genes, that's how we get the cells to specialize into the different types of cells we've learned about. So talk about what is a chromosome. A chromosome is basically just large sections of DNA that have many genes in them. And then we talk about what a gene is. A gene is just a small section of a DNA that does a specific job for a cell. So it's a specific piece of information that the cell needs in order to survive. Then we talked about respiration and photosynthesis. Remember that respiration is that idea of glucose being broken down to produce energy, or things being broken down in order to release energy for cells, and that energy, sometimes you can just refer to it as ATP if you wish. If you want to remember that, it's shorter. When we talk about photosynthesis, of course, is using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and all of these things combined in order to create glucose. Okay, so it's kind of like the reverse of respiration. Then we say how it happens if a person gets cancer. In order to get cancer, that means we had to have uncontrolled cellular division. So the cells are making many, many copies and nothing's stopping them. So you get cancer in the form of a tumor. And then the last part here at the bottom, it says, where do we find these different types of cells? So our ciliated cells, we would find those in the throat, the windpipe, and the lungs. The melanocytes, we would find them in the skin layers, right? And fat cells, we'll find them around all of the organs in the body. Okay, and now we've come to our last set of revision questions and the last slide of this really long revision video. Sorry that it's been so long, but there was a lot of material to cover before we have your unit test. Okay, so pause the video and give these a shot, and then you can unpause it. Yep, you did. All right, so let's go through these. So what job do these tissues do, and what special features do they have that allow them to do those jobs? So for white blood cells, obviously they're going to clean the body and blood of bacteria and viruses, and so they've got really flexible membrane that allows them to be able to do that. Your nerve cells are going to be able to move information around the body and control movement, and that's because they're very long and thin and can spread out over a long distance. And the bone cells, they're going to be there to form bones, which support the body and organs, and they're very dense and hard, and that's the reason why they're able to form these strong bone structures. And then the last part is what happens if these cells are not functioning well. Well, if heart cells are not functioning well, we have a heart attack because the heart will stop pumping. Ciliated cells means the lungs and the throat will be full of mucus and dirt and bacteria, so that means the lungs would get infected. And if the nerve cells were not working well, we would not be able to control the body, it would not be able to move, we would not be able to do lots of things, and we would not survive very long. Okay, so that is it for this revision video. Again, if you have any questions on anything, please let me know.